neste momento, o Supremo Tribunal Federal
The Supreme Federal Court starts the second day of the webinar, Supreme Court's Governance and Democracy, Civil Society Contributions to Improve Governance, and the Supreme Federal Court. The event aims to promote discussions on Supreme Court's governance, judicial governance and democracy with the national and international academic community, relevant public actors, and civil society. The willingness of the Supreme Federal Court to listen to the most innovative ideas and practices is guided by the values of inclusion and participation of the different segments of society in judicial activity in order to privilege active listening in relation to various perspectives, experiences, and knowledge on the topic. The event makes a hot site available on the official page of the Supreme Federal Court, which, in addition to the program, also offers a space for citizen participation so that people, social groups, non-government organizations, human rights units in universities, and other interested parties may send their comments and contributions on the topics debated on the panels. We inform that this webinar is being broadcast live to TV Justiça, as well as 2 channels on YouTube. On the official channel of TV Justice in Portuguese, TV Justiça in Portuguese, and on the official channel of the Supreme Federal Court in English. So we have these 2 official channels, TV Justiça and Supreme Federal Court on YouTube. So we will now start the 3rd panel of this webinar on Supreme Court's society and participation. And I'd like to announce our speakers. Professor Oscar Vilhena Vieira, Director and Professor of FGV Direito São Paulo, with a PhD in Political Science from the University of São Paulo. Dr. Gabriel Sampaio, Coordinator of the Program to Fight Institutional Violence and Strategic Litigation at Conectas Human Rights. Professor Andresa Arusca de Souza Santos from the Latin American Center of Oxford University. She has a PhD in social anthropology by the University of St. Andrews. And the moderator, as moderator, we invited Professor Heloísa Machado de Almeida from FGV Law at São Paulo. She has a doctorate in law from the University of São Paulo. Professor, thank you. You have the floor and moderation. Thank you. Good morning to all of you. It's a huge pleasure to join you this morning on the 2nd day of this webinar on Supreme Court's governance and democracy to address the most important topic, which is participation of civil society in the Supreme Federal Court and constitutional courts around the world. Thank you for the invitation to mediate this panel with colleagues and professors that I admire greatly. And I'd like to congratulate the Supreme Federal Court on the initiative and also this new research coordination for initiating the work by bringing academia and social movements to debate all these relevant topics for the Federal Court. I would like to propose to our colleagues that we begin and then we will move to some final considerations and a dialogue on all the presentations, and I might feel authorized to make some comments regarding the topic of civil society participation. I'd like to give the floor to my dear professor that I had the honor of working with so many years at Getúlio Vargas Foundation, Professor Oscar Vilhena Vieira, for your initial remarks.
Opa, agora sim.
Oscar.
Eu estava tentando dizer que eu não conseguia me auto-mutar. Bom, primeiro, bom dia a todas, a todos. É um prazer enorme estar aqui com pessoas tão queridas Heloísa Machado, que eu poderia trocar de lugar, eu me sentiria mais confortável se ela estivesse falando sobre participação social e eu hospedaria esse debate com o enorme prazer, tenho aprendido com ela há muitos anos sobre isso. Com a professora Andressa, um prazer vê-la aqui e poder participar desse diálogo com você e meu querido amigo Gabriel, que também tem tido um papel muito importante em trazer essa participação social ao Supremo Tribunal Federal. Eu ainda, Heloísa, se você me permite, queria parabenizar o Supremo por essa iniciativa. Eu lembro, ainda na década de 90, aí no África do Sul, participar de um seminário no Centro de Estudos Constitucionais da Corte Constitucional. E aquilo me impressionou muito, porque os ministros estavam lá ouvindo, na época era um grupo de professores estrangeiros, sobre suas percepções, uma corte que se abria, que buscava se tornar muito cosmopolita, e o Supremo agora abre essa coordenadoria que certamente poderá favorecer essa ampliação da interação com o Supremo, com o mundo acadêmico, com a sociedade civil. Então, eu queria parabenizar essa iniciativa e a sua coordenadora e agradecê-la já imediatamente pelo convite. Bom, Elo, se você me permite, eu vou tentar aqui partilhar uma tela, tá? Com vocês. Entrou?
Can you see my screen?
Ops, espera aí que ela está no final da coisa. Pronto. Espero que essa tela esteja visível para todos. Você me dá um positivo? Tá bom. Bom, em primeiro lugar, o que eu queria colocar é que o papel de qualquer corte constitucional ao longo da sua história, ele, além da sua matriz institucional, ele tem uma variação. Né? Se nós pegarmos a Corte Constitucional, o Supremo Tribunal Federal americano, ele vai ter várias fases históricas, assim como a Corte alemã, assim como o Supremo Tribunal Federal brasileiro. E essas fases históricas estão diretamente relacionadas não só com o marco institucional, no caso brasileiro, ou variação, os países não necessariamente, mas, sobretudo, sobre os desafios que eles têm a cada momento. As cortes constitucionais têm que encontrar a sua função em determinados momentos da história se elas não querem se tornar supérfluas ou absolutamente irrelevantes do ponto de vista histórico. Então, é dentro desse contexto que eu gostaria de falar, antes de entrar especificamente sobre a atuação do Supremo Tribunal Federal nesse momento em relação à participação social, tentar entender o momento, quais são os desafios desse momento, de maneira o Supremo Tribunal Federal se coloca dentro desse jogo de poder a que a sociedade, a qual a sociedade brasileira está submetida nesse momento. Então, a primeira coisa que nós não podemos descartar é que nós vivemos, como Larry Diamond já colocava no início da década, nós vivemos um período de forte recessão democrática. E ao longo dos anos 80, nós tivemos um conjunto de nações muito grande que se democratizou. Nós, a partir da última década, nós temos países que estão se desdemocratizando, alguns que estão estagnando o seu processo de democratização e outros que estão entrando num período que algumas pessoas chamam, eu chamo particularmente, de um período de regressão democrática, ou seja, onde a qualidade do seu regime passa a deteriorar. É um momento que não significa que nós perdemos a democracia, mas é um momento onde a democracia está sob forte estresse. Essa onda de populismo autocrático, essa nova onda de populismo, ela está certamente ligada a três elementos, ou pelo menos a dois elementos fortíssimos. Um primeiro elemento, sem dúvida nenhuma, é aquilo que o Bob falava num livrinho magnífico e clássico, que é o Futuro da Democracia, que são as promessas não cumpridas da democracia liberal. né? Em que medida a democracia liberal não cumpriu a universalização dos direitos? Imagino no Brasil, quanto isso é forte, né? O quanto a falta de transparência, o quanto a falta de integridade, o quanto a falta de representatividade vão gerar uma quebra de expectativa e uma frustração social em relação a essas democracias de natureza liberal. Por outro lado, em alguns países, não só há uma frustração, mas também uma ampliação do processo de desconfiança das instituições. No caso brasileiro, sem dúvida nenhuma, o ciclo de retaliação institucional que nós passamos a viver entre 2013 e 2018 gerou uma percepção de que as instituições não estavam cumprindo as suas tarefas, mas sim que as prerrogativas institucionais estavam sendo utilizadas com finalidades políticas. Então, nós temos essas duas características no caso brasileiro, que certamente geraram aí um espaço para que uma política de ressentimento triunfasse. Então, como eu costumo dizer, populistas florescem onde há promessas não cumpridas, onde há desconfiança nas instituições. E qual que é a natureza desse populismo? Veja, é um termo vacante que desde o século XVIII serve para caracterizar diversas coisas, inclusive movimentos populares, movimentos contrários à ortodoxia econômica. Então, é uma palavra que nós temos que ter cuidado. Nós temos que caracterizar que nós estamos falando de um tipo específico de populismo que ressurge aí no século XXI. Eu diria que duas características fundamentais devem descrever esse populismo. Em primeiro lugar, é que essas lideranças que surgem no momento de confiança institucional, elas buscam encarnar ou expressam serem as únicas representantes autênticas da vontade popular. E com isso surge uma consequência. Todos os outros que se avocam à representação popular são vistos como inimigos e, portanto, devem ser combatidos. Então, o populismo contemporâneo ele tem uma natureza essencialmente pluralista. Ele é contrário a outras concepções de nação. O populismo contemporâneo, ele cria, ele molda, ele projeta uma concepção de nação e todas as outras concepções são excluídas. O fato de que as comunidades indígenas estejam sendo alvo preferencial desse governo porque elas não cabem na construção do conceito de nação expresso pelo líder populista que nos governa. Então, isso eu gostaria de frisar, porque está relacionado diretamente com o que a gente vai falar sobre o papel do Supremo Tribunal Federal. E o ataque, como eles agem, evidentemente, buscando subverter essa democracia liberal através de mudanças legislativas, emendas à Constituição, como nós assistimos em países como a Hungria, como a Polônia, como a Turquia, e a Índia, que está na mesma direção. Então, essa é a estratégia, chegar ao poder e utilizar o poder para a erosão das instituições, inclusive as instituições do Estado de Direito. Bom, a pergunta fundamental e aonde nós colocamos é se há alguma especificidade de modelos políticos que possam se demonstrar mais resilientes a um processo de tomada de poder pelo populismo. Será que existe uma diferenciação institucional que pode ser favorável a que em alguns países o populismo seja metabolizado de forma diferente? Eu creio que sim. Eu creio que em democracias majoritárias, I believe that in models where there is a fusion between legislative and executive branches, that is parliamentarism, the arrival of populism to power means that they have a majority in National Congress. And when this happens in countries that are parliamentarist countries, this erosion process is faster. Tem maioria
if there is
que pode, inclusive,
substantive majority that may guarantee constitutional amendments, then erosion will happen faster. In presidentialist regimes, this will depend on the relationship with the parliament, between the parliament and the number of parties. And I believe this is an important variable. And the major characteristics are seen of our regime. And when I talk about a consensual regime, I would like to quote Dibhart, who describes the mechanisms that are counter-majority. The higher the number of such mechanisms, the more consensual the regime will be. So, those with majority in parliament wins. And on the other side, I see the Brazilian regime, the Brazilian type, where winning does not necessarily mean an alignment with all the other powers, with bicameral kind of regimes, the constitutional courts, etc. Several mechanisms. In Brazil, two structures are very strong as counter-majority instruments. First of all, the coalition presidentialism. So, an electoral victory in the executive means that if the president would like to approve laws in Congress, he or she will need to be in line with the legislative, to dialogue with the legislative. This has worked in Brazil from the office of Itamar, President Itamar, until the office of President Temer, a very minoritarian president, but who was able to build this basis for support within Congress. Another specificity of the model in Brazil is a Supreme Court. And Albert yesterday mentioned that very few courts in the world has the power that the Brazilian court has, because it gathers three spheres. It is last appeal, first level for political, administrative, and it is also a constitutional court. And access to it, is broad, unfortunately not by civil society, but by corporations and politicians. But the court is very powerful in the political perspective, so we can call it a Supreme Court. We have that, even because it has the last word regarding constitutional amendments. So how can this populism work and survive and take in political decisions within the consensual regime in Brazil? I would say that, first of all, the fact that our President Bolsonaro, has not until March looked for the construction of a parliamentarian basis. This has generated the situation we are undergoing through now. He has had not success with Parliament. So only 31% of his sendings to Congress have been approved, and all those, out of all those, only 50% came from the executive. But just to give you an idea, this dominance rate regarding previous offices used to be 90%, and the success rate varied between 60 and 80%. That is, the president is clearly
weak in Parliament. It is also concerning the amount of provisional measures that were approved, and most of them that we know that it's very powerful to a president of the Republic. He also has had a low success rate in this area too. And the measures that have been approved, I'd like to call your attention to the following. 85% of those are in the area of budgets, but regarding the other topics, the rate of failure is very high. Now, my question, are they efficient? In some measure, yes, but that does not mean that the president does not have other ways of being or working within the parliamentarian control system. And here we arrive to a silent erosion of the strategies regarding rights. In a constitution that is so daring, such as the Brazilian one, we know that many of the rights determined the creation of several institutions in order to deal with these rights in education, in health, and other areas. We have several levels of the state which are responsible for the implementation of this project of nation that is in our Constitution. What we see in our government is a systemic action towards restructuring these bureaucracies, and also the indication or the indication of persons for the mission of these agencies, such as the Palmares Foundation, etc. And on the other side, we have cuts in budgets or non-use of budgets. And we see that with the Human Rights Secretariat. And a set of administrative rules that defy legality, and Heloísa mentioned a different term, but she mentioned acts that are para-institutional. And within this menu of actions by the government to provoke this constitutional regression, we have tweets and orders and actions that are not determinable. And several of these institutions had changes in their structure and in their bodies.
Só para que a gente tenha pequeno quadro, é interessante.
In order for us to have an overview, it is interesting to look at this slide. The use of restructuring of collegiate bodies in the Bolsonaro office is much higher than all other or previous offices. 47%
as competências desses colegiados, alterar a composição desses
órgãos de
participação
or the structure of these collegiates.
Então vocês veem no quadro à direita
We can also see
uma
on the right
reestruturação administrativa muito forte,
a very strong trend towards restructuring public administration and a much higher number of decrees than the previous presidents. President Trump also used this strategy when because he didn't have a majority in the lower chamber, he started to use decrees, and he started to reconfigure the American international policy.
Poder da BIC para poder revolver,
and he does that by decree in order to erode in the levels of rights implementations or rights enforcement. Not to mention the indications of people who are against the objectives of institutions. And now I would like to talk about the place where does the Supreme Court is when there is a president hostile to the Constitution and constitutional institutions. Well, the Supreme Court has its own idiosyncrasies. It received a high level of power with very powerful prerogatives, but it also has, because of the exercise of this supremacy, it has eroded to a certain level its reputational capital, because it emerged in the crisis of 2013 and 18,
where its role was questioned. And so the Supreme arrives in 2018 with quite exhausted, and this generates a position or a more cautious and pragmatic position. And so we have two indicators here: appointment of a general to advise the Supreme Federal Court, appointed by the general that had threatened previously the Supreme Court. And so that's a sign that is very significant regarding this hyper-cautious position of the Supreme Court, and also the sign of the Republican Pact, which is not the role of a court to engage in this kind of bargaining, political bargaining. But this position did not prevent the Supreme Court, even or in spite of its deferring position. There are some interests of the government that the Supreme Court went against, but this changed as of March this year, and as Eloisa also mentioned. And so this change is the result, in my view, of escalation of threats to the Supreme Court through manifestations by Bolsonaro supporters and endorsed by the president himself, and also from his own office, making threats to against the Constitutional Court. But this, coincidentally, also happens with the beginning of the pandemic, when the irrational and negational and the denial behavior generated strong demands on for the Supreme Court to limit the powers of the president in regards to the pandemic. And so I see the strengthening of the Supreme Federal Court, a kind of a reactivation of the Supreme Federal Court. And this, no doubt, happens as a result of access that parliamentary political minorities have, their access to the Supreme Court. And so many cases actually started by these political parties, and also social participation in all these cases, when they were not actually started by civil society. Civil society very quickly joins these actions and cases and makes itself heard along the judicial process. And so in this sense, when we have a populist executive leadership, the defense of pluralist democracy, which is the model adopted by the 1988 Constitution through its structure of principles, and also through its organizational system. A supra-party system that we have is the expression of pluralism as a wide charter of rights, which allows civil society to
E a Suprema Corte
enjoy a very plural
passa a ser uma arena
system, and the Supreme Court becomes an arena where these pluralist interests will seek protection
da Corte,
of the court
das hostilidades que vêm
as a result of hostilities emanating from an anti-pluralist executive. I will not reproduce. In 2019 can be characterized as a year of deference of the Supreme Court to this anti-pluralist president. And in 2020, a significant change of position through the fake news inquiry, for instance, which is aimed at combating attacks against the court, and also the federative balance, and several actions establishing governors and mayors as major players in the right to health and protection of the right to health. There's also the issue of the Amazon Fund, with a public hearing aimed at ensuring pluralism, and also a range of other key decisions that were taken along these few months after March this year, imposing limits to actions that are hostile to the Constitution. Now, my last slide. What are the challenges that the Supreme Court has at a time like this? Yesterday, this was also mentioned by the debaters. It is not common for constitutional courts, when they face a populist escalation, they can be defeated. This happened in Venezuela, this happened in Russia, it happened in Hungary, and it happened in Poland as well. And after decades, it also happened in Turkey. This doesn't mean that other countries such as South Africa and Colombia, the constitutional courts haven't been relevant players in protecting constitutional integrity in face of the hostility emanating from autocratic populism. And so very quickly, it seems to me that the set of actions of the Supreme Federal Court needs to be based on consistent changes in position if it wants to fulfill the mission that has been attributed to it constitutionally. So the first, which is a common sense, it is the issue of collegiality. The Supreme has powers as long as exercised in a collegiate. If exercised monocratically, power is fragmented and runs the risk of erosion. Also, there is a certain degree of circumspection from the point of view of its loquacity. And the more the Supreme Court positions itself as a political actor, the less legal authority it has. The third is consistency of its decisions. Decisions cannot be contradictory, as if it were making political choices according to the case. Fourth, opening. And this is opening to the more vulnerable groups. If the Supreme Court wants to have a reputation and reputational capital, it must work with the main targets of attacks and hostilities. So both Luisa and others have been demonstrating the importance in Brazil of the public hearings, and so there must be big responsibility. It means responding very quickly to any violations of rights, and also changing direction a little bit. A lot of attention needs to be given to the type of aggression against constitutional order, which is no longer aggression through unconstitutional laws or amendments, but rather processes or administrative processes that generate erosion of the system of protection and promotion of rights. And so control must be exercised on public policies and processes that alter competencies in administrative bodies. And there needs to be clarity regarding deviation of purpose and erosion of the Constitution. So once again, thank you very much for the generous
invitation. Eu queria agradecer
aos
meus colegas Rubens, Leslie e Eliana Laura, com o qual nós estamos trabalhando esse paper que hoje apresentei aqui.
Working on the paper that I presented here.
Obrigado,
they are my partners in this paper. So, Heloísa, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing the next
agora, como eu removo isso daqui, ou você consegue remover? Pronto. Obrigado.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Oscar, for the extraordinary presentation with a very contemporary perception of the challenges of the Supreme Federal Court. And especially in view of the current presidency. And now, before I give the floor to Dr. Gabriel Sampaio, I'd like to say that this role of multi-party regime and the relationship between the presidency with the National Congress, this is absolutely relevant in the arena of the Supreme Federal Court. And it is quite noticeable, the increase of constitutional litigation coming from non-aligned parties with the presidency of the Republic, which shows a certain degree of reaction and also the controls of these constitutional attacks. And so I am anxious to read your paper, and congratulations on your extraordinary presentation. I'd like to give the floor now to Gabriel Sampaio, Dr. Gabriel Sampaio, coordinator of the program on institutional violence of Conectas, an organization that I'm very familiar with. Gabriel, you have the floor. You have 20 minutes. Professor Oscar went over his time just a little bit, but we might make up some time afterwards. Thank you. Good morning, Professor Heloísa Machado. I thank you very much for this presentation and this introduction. I'd like to greet also Professor Oscar Villena for his brilliant presentation, also Professor Andresa Santos. It is an honor to participate in this debate and to learn with people who are so inspiring in the struggle for human rights in Brazil, such as Professor Heloísa already said, I am part of Conectas Direitos Humanos, an organization founded by Professor Oscar, with who participated in its construction, especially in strategic litigation, which is the field of Professor Heloísa Machado.
I'm also very proud to be part of this debate. It is huge responsibility to speak in such a qualified round of presentations, especially after Professor Oscar Villena. But I do have a commitment when I speak about this topic, and also to speak in the Justice Council. It is a commitment with my origins, with my ancestrality and the organization I am part of. So I do need to have an epistemological commitment as well, which is to place as the core of the question structural racism in Brazil. We live a moment of a crisis, and a crisis in the rule of law. I will speak about some topics also mentioned by Professor Oscar Villena. There is huge requirements and demands from civil society in terms of access equality, and access to the justice system. We are being pressured by society, by the challenge of overcoming both structural racism and also the basis of the rule of law. In his book, more than the class thought, race has always been the shadow, always present in the policies of the East, especially when we think about racism and lack of humanity. Racism is a technology aimed at allowing for the old sovereign right to kill, making possible these atrocities. We are in a moment when society and the East have debated the topic of racism after the growth of the anti-racism fight, after the episodes in the US. The component of this fight and this challenge of defending the rule of law with the component of structural racism going into the debate for the defense of democracy. It is not uncommon in rules of law dealing with crisis. In several countries, as mentioned by Professor Oscar, the crisis of legitimacy affects liberal institutions in democracies. It emerges with a destination crisis. When the revolutionaries in France brought the essential basis for the building of fundamental rights and guarantees, we know how much we needed to fight as Black persons and Black peoples to defend these same ideals. And now we live in this crisis, one that affects its legitimacy. According to Manuel Castells, over 2/3 of the inhabitants in the planet challenge the interests that move the interests of liberal democracies. And this model is based on an essential basis, the separation of powers, the executive, the legislative and judiciary, elections, the eligibility of people as sovereign in the rule of law, those who received delegation of power by citizens, the possibility of reviewing the constitutions, public matters to be open and carried out in an openly manner by politicians, by the political powers, and including other powers, economic or ideological. This crisis of legitimacy that affects this model based on essential or fundamental guarantees and rights, etc., affects not only democracy, but this model of liberal democracy where institutions are also placed in a challenge. In this moment of crisis, we cannot dissociate from the association, we cannot dissociate from the crisis that started in 2008 and now with the pandemics, further weakening the social fabric. We are in a pandemic, in a situation where there's huge mortality among the Black populations. Social inequalities are increasing. Those who are rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. And in the necropolis policy or politics, when we talk about biopower in a space of death, the Black population suffers a disproportional hit. And after the pandemics, there are new elements that further pressure and affect the rule of law and fundamental rights and guarantees. To some extent, at this moment, we have a weakening that is also here in Brazil, happening here in Brazil, as already mentioned by Professor Oscar Vilhena. And within this epistemology aimed at racism in Brazil, we do need to recognize that we have our history marked by 4 centuries of slavery and only 1 century, a little bit more than 1 century of post-slavery regimes. Within our Republican history, in several parts of our history, we have always had this same pressure. It is marked by the way that we did not fight and actually overcome structural racism. We are a republic that emerged without tackling the shadow of slavery in our nation. And along several moments, this happened, and we have not been able to effectively overcome structural racism. The 88 Constitution was an opportunity for us to overcome this deficit, this destination crisis that we have been living along our history. It opens up a portal for strengthening fundamental rights and guarantees and creates a menu of rights that is the basis for so many struggles and fights of our civil society. And as Abranches would say, the quality of democracy is also measured by the good working and good results of its institutions and governments expressed in good general conditions of life, public and private services. And the democracy here in Brazil, unfortunately, is not getting good evaluations. And in this area of structural racism, placing as a challenge for civil society to tackle this element, then we can see how much inequalities affect Black populations regarding per capita income, where we have in the Black population, in its majority, living with incomes up to 1.5 minimum wages. The disparity between whites and Blacks are always high.
While 36% of the population makes up to 1.5 minimum salary among white population, among the Black population, this doubles, the figure doubles. The value obtained from salaries by Black people make 62% of the salary mass of the white population. If Blacks make up 56% of the Brazilian population, among the 10% poorest, 76% are Black. Among the 1% richest, only 17.4% are Black. And when we visit the last annuary on violence, we'll find data, even more surprising data. 74% of victims of homicide in Brazil are Black, of deaths caused by police interventions. Professor Oscar, almost 80% are against Black people. I have been repeating whenever I can, and I feel privileged as a Black person to be at this forum, on this panel, addressing this. What democracy are we talking about? What construction of democratic rule of law are we talking about? I go back to this author here talking about necropolicy, the people who are dying, killed by the state, almost 80% of violent deaths and homicides today. Almost 75% are Black people. It's the contradiction and dialectic of construction of the liberal democracy, when, such as happened in Haiti, the democratic rule of law, does it serve the whole population? The historical series repeat themselves. At some point in the fight against institutional violence, it was believed that if inequality bases in Brazil were tackled, we would have results in the fight against institutional racism. But this was a historical mistake. It was believed that by tackling income inequality, the results would come in this area. But the contrary is true. Professor Luisa, Professor Andres, and Professor Oscar, every time the state is silent before this reality, 80% of deaths caused by the state are against Black people. What can one say regarding the material content of our democracy, the challenges for civil society and institutional structures? For a long time, data on violent deaths lacked sufficient methodology for certain conclusions to be reached. But we can say now, Professor Luisa, that at least 8, 9, 10 years, for the past 10 years, we are better able to attest the reliability of these data. If I were a public manager, if I had more power in my hands, when seeing data where the structure of the state that I am part of kills, and 80% of violent deaths by intervention of state agents target Black people, the reversal of this process should be a priority. It is inconceivable that this is not the central topic for all our public activity. In opposition to this, unfortunately, in the institutional field, there's the existence of a denial, a narrative that denies the pandemic, it denies science, it denies the impacts of the current policies on climate, on vulnerable people, and also denying this phenomenon of violent deaths in the country. Because if data indicate that 76% of violent deaths against the Black people and institutional violence against Black people, over 70% of homicides with the use of firearms. And from the institutional point of view, what happens? An incentive to ownership of firearms. So the civilizing standard has been lowered. Professor Eloisa, I haven't even started counting my time yet. Yeah, I just sent you a private message. So, yeah, I asked at the right time because I still have to mention some other important issues. Just a last thing that because this epistemological resource of talking about institutional racism, this is very much related to something really important for the Black population, which is the right to life. And so among the privileges that I have speaking here is the privilege of being alive and being here. And so our agenda starts with the right to life until it gets to the right of representation. The right of representation is a challenge for civil society, for institutionality, for the Supreme Courts. Also, to tackle the issue of representation, but still on institutional violence, the staggering number of Black population in penitentiary units. 2 in every 3 are Black in prisons and in prison inmates. And if on the one hand, civil society, organized civil society, has been seeking through structural litigation to unveil this reality of institutional obstacles and violations against fundamental rights. So if we were able to reveal inconstitutionalities in the prison system, after 5 years of this decision, we still have staggering data against the Black population. So there's an increase of Black inmates in prisons. So after so much effort, we were able to recognize the institution, the anti-constitutional state of affairs. And in the field of efficacy of decisions and efficacy of fundamental rights, the response we have is, once again, lack of understanding and lack of tackling of the racial component. And all the factors that aggravate this crisis are still present. And there's a role for the Supreme Courts here as well. So what increases the policy of violence and the policy of imprisonment is the drug legislation. Even when fundamental rights and guarantees that are recognized are not applied in judicial decisions, and the Supreme Courts correct this, this is still not applied in the courts. And so there's the decision of the Higher Court of Justice regarding the applicability of the law on drugs. Also, the binding decisions, the lack of binding decisions to confer greater legal security to interrupt violations caused by the interpretation of the law on drugs regarding users and privileged traffic. All these are tasks that are under the responsibility of judicial control. And I'd like to conclude now because, well, I know I need to conclude, but I'd like to point out the importance of civil society organizations in this historical moment that requires a response to all the pressures that we are suffering against our rights, and also the DPF, the DPF on slums. When we have the participation of civil society in face of the Supreme Courts, and we have a catalog of civil society organizations that had never before accessed the judiciary, and they went to the Supreme Federal Court, some without legal personality, but they were born in the heart of institutional racism and genocidal policies. Mãe de Manguinhos, Fala Cari, mostly Black women in the poor communities of our country who decided to access the Supreme Federal Court, bringing documents. and tears to reveal the cruel reality that our country is experiencing and tell the Supreme Court that this policy of public security policy practiced in Rio de Janeiro and other slums all over the country, which is producing black bodies, black dead bodies. And so it's a public policy that needs to be rejected by our justice system. These people, these organizations that we had the opportunity to contribute to, and they are seeking participation in the Supreme Federal Courts.
Because they need to defend their own lives, because they fight as Zumbi dos Palmares fought, Dandara fought, Cortirene, as Esperanza Garcia, as Luiz Gama fought, as so many heroes fought against institutional violence in our country, defending their lives in different ways. But now the historical moment imposes the search for the Supreme Court, so that it is the champion of the defense of fundamental rights and guarantees and the rule of law, and that it is also active in fighting structural racism. I had a lot more to speak about the participation of civil society, but this epistemological commitment brought me to speak to you about structural racism. I do apologize if I was not able to cover my challenge to speak about the civil society and its fight for the right to live. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gabriel, for your contribution, for your presentation. I was remembering when you were speaking about the importance of movements, even non-formal movements have access to the Federal Supreme Court. Obviously, we are also talking about movements that are composed of Black men and women from the different areas, all the different areas in the country. And the quality of decisions reflects those who are authorized to address interpretations. And this action was mentioned in both presentations. The control mentioned both by Professor Oscar Vilhena and Professor Gabriel Sampaio, they both mentioned the promise, the unfulfilled promises of our 88 Constitution, opening the path for the recognition of structural racism in institutions. It is a late agenda, we know, for us to think about. Not only judiciary, the prosecution service, and all the agents of law. Thank you, Gabriel, for your presentation. And now I give the floor to Professor Andressa Arusca de Silva Santos. You have 20 minutes, and I will send you messages if I need to, because we need to close at 10:40, because we are broadcasting to Justiça TV. But Professor Andressa, you have the floor. Thank you. It is an honor being here. I'd like to thank for the organizers of this event, and also like to salute my colleagues, Professor Oscar Vilhena, Dr. Gabriel Sampaio, and Eloisa Machado. I will start by mentioning something that Gabriel mentioned. We overcame slavery without overcoming racism. And here we are talking about civil society in politics without overcoming inequalities. So we create instruments for social participation in the 80s, the last decade, with huge inflation, unemployment, when we used to see people in vulnerable situations, and we created mechanisms to make it possible for these people to speak. But this participation comes with huge social vulnerability, and those who depend on the state need to speak against the state and established powers, and the cost of this participation is too high and therefore non-efficient. So I'd like to discuss civil society participation. What is this policy of non-political agents? The policies of those who are governed. When does it have a space and when it is silenced? In order for us to understand the policy of those governed, we need to think about small cities in Brazil. We're a huge country. We have over 5,500 municipalities, more the federal district in Fernando de Noronha. And in this huge country, we have a huge amount of very small towns and also mid-sized towns with less than 100,000 inhabitants. But we focus on large urban centers, and very often we do not have a political view of civil society participation in small and mid-sized cities. And I focus on them because they are places where there's huge intersection between private and public lives. What you do in your profession and how you manifest a political view may affect or may have a weight on your life. And when you open your view of life, very often you may affect your social relations. And sometimes you're not directly affected, but your son or your cousin will be because your action. When I did ethnography in small towns of Minas Gerais, someone told me, you go to a social participation council, you speak about your view, and then the subject is your bank manager. And this happens less in large towns. In addition to this extreme exposure of people in the public and private domains, there's also economic vulnerability. Not always people have a good job or a guarantee in terms of jobs. And this affects informal economies, economies that depend on friendships and indications. And it is very hard for people because this also affects people's economic and private lives. Today, the reality in Brazil, even in large cities, is a reality of self-censorship, exposure of people in social media, and even those with political capital that are used to exposing their views and participating in civil society organizations, they sometimes feel they are being punished, for example, or looked at in their jobs, in their lives. So they feel they don't have guarantees regarding their economic survival. So when, in terms of political participation, we think about these two lines I'd like to comment here today. One, motivation for participation, this agenda of participation, and the other, the ability or capacity of participation. For the first one, this agenda of civil participation, of social participation, is the motive or the reason why people engage on a fight. Very often, racism, gender, public security. There are lots of demands in civil society, and we associate participation of civil society in politics with this agenda of rights inclusion. So we think about social movements to improve transportation, living conditions, education, health, access to public services.
Now, the contradiction is that when we think about capacity for mobilization and duration of mobilization and cost of mobilization, we are thinking of an ascending society. So it looks like a contradiction. You have, on the one hand, a bigger agenda if you have more poverty, but you have, on the other hand, greater capacity if you have greater economic stability. And so when we see lack of social movements, it's not necessarily absence of motivation and an agenda to mobilize around, but rather lack or absence of capacity and high cost of participation, political participation of society. So if we think of motivation and capacity, it's interesting to analyze 2013 when we saw major social movements and people going to the streets. So to talk about 2013, I will again analyze a smaller city so that we can imagine what was happening. So let's take the city of Mariana in Minas Gerais. It's a city that in 2013 was experiencing the boom of commodities. We had a decade from 2002 to 2012 with the cycle of commodities, and Brazil experiencing major economic growth with a drop in unemployment, universities expanding. And that was the scenario. And so in that city, Mariana, there was real estate speculation because it concentrated mining, which was expanding, as well as universities also expanding. The campus of the Federal University of Ouro Preto is located there, and it's a historical and touristic city. So the price of housing is quite high because the center cannot expand to accommodate greater demand for housing, and a new middle class with access to education, to jobs, but not to housing. This is something that you see in many other cities around Brazil, with workers, with formal jobs, getting to the universities with access to education, but this does not translate to better quality of life. So in this city, Mariana, but many others around Brazil, this centrifugal growth of the city towards the periphery and a population that spends 3-4 hours commuting and up to 30%, spending up to 30% of their income on commuting. Because the problem in 2013, the spark, the trigger of the movements in 2013 was very much related to the price of public transport. And this is related to the growth of cities, a peripheral growth without quality, and a population that had access to education, jobs, and leisure. And this generates a major contradiction. And in this specific group that I studied, this contradiction generated a social movement with people who are at university and that have jobs, but they live in places where there is no garbage collection, no public transportation, no public lighting, without numbered houses, without and children without schools. But it's a population that has motivation and agenda, and also a capacity to mobilize and sustain the mobilization. And this is what happened in that year. And who are the agents of this transformation? It was women and Black women, not by chance. And why? Community movements and community leaders, why are they generally women? Very often because women are very capable in mediating between the home and the street. The women who don't have good housing, good public lighting, access to daycare centers, women who don't have a well-defined routine because they have to take care of children, they have this care role. They need public transportation with quality all day because their routine is very unstable. And so these women, very often, they take on this community leadership because they have this agenda. But there needs to be capacity as well. So at that moment, the women were capable of mobilizing. They were university women, and they had this agenda. Now, on the limits of this social movements, and these neighborhood and community movements and participation of civil society, very often having capacity, having motivation to mobilize, does not necessarily mean that you will capitalize from all the gains of the movement. And still on this example, in this community, the agenda of improvements for this neighborhood, it wasn't controlled by the social movement, it was controlled by the government. And so they were able to implement certain changes in that neighborhood, but these changes were controlled by the government. And so what was the first step taken there? It was paving of streets is politically powerful. It silences traffic. It increases the value of the houses. And so with pavement, you have a decreased pressure of social movements, because many families actually were happy with the pavement and stopped demanding more, such as, for instance, sanitation, which is a much less visible public policy. And the political capital of having a social movement that was started by two Black women, university women. And so they did not gain from this. It was actually other actors who gained from this, who benefited from this. And if we take this example to think of the protests in 2013 and several other social movements, it's not necessarily the people starting these movements and this agenda that actually capitalize and accumulate political gains from these social movements. So to conclude with the example of this small city and contributing to a broader debate, we need to think that in what we see here in Brazil with economic decline and greater flexibility of labor relations, looser labor relations, we have more people depending on the state, a state that has less capacity to intervene, and people at much greater social vulnerability. And this generates lots of shocks. One might think, when you have more poverty, when you have greater dependency on the state and decreased capacity of the state, that's when you will have more protests, greater social pressure, and social accountability being put to the test. And alongside this, you also have more flexible or loosening of labor relations and more precarious labor relations. What happens is a kind of silencing of society. And so we need to think of social participation not only in terms of laws that exist to guarantee participation, but also in terms of efficacy and the ways society is organized, which entails the demographic characteristics of cities, gender characteristics, racial characteristics, as well as economic characteristics, so that we might determine whether these social movements are in fact sustainable, or are we creating the participation of experts from society, people who have a voice, who have political capital, who have educational capital, and who are still able to have a voice. So how can we expand this voice and guarantee efficiency? So today, when we see lack of protests and a kind of self-censorship, we might think what can be done regarding this. Well, James Scott used to say there are other non-direct forms of resistance. One of them is to have different leaders of social movements and fragmenting it so that you don't have easy targets. Other forms of resistance that he mentioned in his famous book, Weapons of the Weak, which is a book worth reading today. But we need to think of forms of resistance, but also what is happening in terms of self-censorship of society. When we see, for instance, the dismissal of Ricardo Galvão, director of INPE, and people who are losing their voice and their job because they're doing their job. And so there's this kind of intimidation going on. Even sectors of society that enjoy a certain economic stability and job stability, such as civil servants, people fear losing stability or being put in the fridge when you don't lose your job, but you lose a leadership position or any possibility to intervene. So this happens not only in small cities, but also in major urban centers, not only among the poor population, but also a population that used to enjoy this political capital. And so I'd like to introduce this discussion then, that we had the creation of a citizen constitution in 1988, which provides guarantees and creates participatory councils and several management instruments where the population is able to control the state and also manage some of the excesses of the state. We have instruments such as the Statute of Cities, increasing the control mechanisms and the participatory steering plans and several other management instruments. But we still have a society that is unequal, with huge gender and racial and economic inequalities that often limit how people will position themselves, who will have a voice, and whether these councils and management instruments will work more effectively. We cannot have a society that is so well known for its protests and its participatory councils, but a society where we still hear people saying that those who order, there are those who order and those who obey. Thank you. Extraordinary, Andresa. I think your contribution helps us look at the outside door of the court and understand these dynamics, and also the challenges imposed by social distancing, how to participate and control and so on when the councils, the public hearings, the meetings are all suspended. So it's a huge challenge for us to think of participation in view of the huge inequality of access to the means available for interlocution with authorities that are available. So unequal access to internet, for instance, as you mentioned, and Gabriel and Oscar mentioned.
We have 5 minutes for the closure of this panel, and I would like to give 1 minute for you to have your closing remarks. And I would like to reiterate that formal participation of society in the Supreme Court has been a breakthrough along the last 20 years for those who are legitimate users, and also through the amicus curiae and the public hearings carried out by the Supreme Court. In the last survey I carried out for my doctor's thesis showed that over 1/3 of the cases here at the Supreme Court had at least one participation of amicus curiae, and actions such or cases such as DPF 442 and dealing with the rights of women and the right to interrupt pregnancies. And we also have the public hearing. The topic of Lívia Guimarães, who is now the coordinator for research here at the Supreme Court, and its dialogue with the academic society, trying to understand what is the potential of this tool, which are the public hearings. So I also would like to mention this here for those who would like to know or to have further information or additional information about it. Now I'll give you, each one of you, 1 minute to carry out your closing remarks.
Eu gostaria apenas de agradecer imensamente o convite que me foi feito pela Lívia Guimarães. Eu ia mencionar exatamente a tese dela sobre as audiências públicas, que é muito ilustrativo, né, sobre o que vem acontecendo, sobre as deficiências e sobre o que pode ser corrigido para que essas audiências, de fato, contribuam mais para que o Supremo possa se tornar um âmbito de defesa pluralista da democracia. E é citar também a tese de doutorado da professora Luísa, que trata desse outro aspecto que são os amigos. É uma invenção antiga, mas que chegou no Brasil de maneira atrasada e que vem sendo empregada de uma forma que não é superficial. Nós estamos aprendendo a lidar com isso, mas de fato os amigos não só se tornaram uma coisa corriqueira no tribunal, né, como eles têm sido levados em consideração em alguma medida. Quer dizer, tem gerado algum tipo de reação. Então, eu queria agradecer imensamente ao convite, desejar as melhores sortes a essa coordenadoria, algo que o Supremo necessitava, que agora foi construído, parabenizar o presidente por isso, a Lívia por ter aceitado essa posição. E dar abraço e beijo dos meus queridos companheiros de painel.
Also, I'd like to salute my colleagues in this panel. They are all very dear to me. I learned a lot with you.
E olhar ali no cantinho da minha tela, minha querida professora Maria Tereza Sadek, já estava esperando
Maria Tereza.
Beijo para ela também.
And I salute her too. Thank you, Gabriel. Your last closing remarks. I'd like to thank you. It was an honor for me to be here and also a huge responsibility, as I mentioned. And I just would like to mention that the scenario against the attack to fundamental rights and guarantees generate this environment of pressure. And there are several litigations going on. Professor Eloisa mentioned DPF 442. I mentioned 635 of slums. The quilombolas also organized themselves and they went to the Supreme to talk about their causes, and the indigenous peoples also went to the Supreme Court, and structural racism need to be tackled. Here we have Professor Oscar, Professor Maria Tereza, also here with us, and our transition justice reserved a place for the military justice, and it is being repositioned today on a decision of 2017. Today, we're talking about crime of abuse and torture, and it is being dealt with the military justice. But this violence suffered by the Black populations needs to be tackled, and it cannot go to the military justice for this type of crime. I apologize for exceeding my time, and I'd like to thank you for the opportunity of being with you. Thank you. And there are cases that are here for these days, all those that you mentioned. Thank you. Andressa? Thank you very much for this space. It is fantastic for us to have a space for the academic community here in the Supreme Court, not only the national one, but the international one, and also that we include the fact that we include different disciplines. It is a great debate, and I'd like to thank my colleagues, Professor Oscar, Gabriel, Luiz, all of you. Thank you very much for the invitation again. Thank you all very much. Professor Oscar, Gabriel, Andressa, it was a pleasure being here. It was an honor moderating this conversation, and I wish you all fruitful work for the next panels. Bye-bye. Thank you, Professor Heloísa Machado, who moderated this panel, and also we'd like to thank all the other participants. We are now going into the fourth panel on the topic Supreme Court Governance and the 2030 Agenda. We announce the participation of the following speakers: Professor Maria Teresa Sadek from the University of São Paulo, Doctor in Political Science by the same institution. Also, Professor Daniel Mitidiero of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, Doctor in Law by the same institution, and also Council Member Maria Teresa Willy Gomes of the National Council of Justice and Attorney of Justice of the State of Paraná, Doctor in Sociology by the Federal University of Paraná. And as a moderator, we are pleased to invite Professor Gierle Coelho Nunes of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Doctor in Law by the PUC, the Catholic University of Minas Gerais. Thank you. You have the floor and you have the moderation of this panel. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure being able to participate in this panel on Supreme Court's governance and the 2030 agenda. We have the opportunity of speaking to 3 scholars and jurists that will be able to contribute to this debate. So we need to, we are going to include the MDGs, the SDGs, and now, without further ado, I'd like to call Professor Maria Teresa Sadek. She is going to present to us now, and I ask you all to respect the 15 to 20 minute period of time. Professor Maria Teresa, you have the floor. Thank you. I thank you. And I'm going to share the screen of the presentation. But first, I'd like to say that we are inaugurating a new phases in the Supreme Court, especially Professor Lívia. I'd like to thank her for this type of initiative. And I really wanted to say to you that we had several lessons. Professor Oscar spoke about essential topics, democracy and the role of the Supreme Court, that is even more important in the moment we are going through right now. I am going to speak about
So I'm going to talk about governance. William? So I will quickly go over these issues to get to the heart of what I want to explain, which is the fundamental issue regarding the role of the Supreme Court and all the challenges that we have ahead of us. I will start with this definition here, a basic definition given by the World Bank regarding governance. Bank defines governance as the way in which power is exercised in the administration of social and economic resources of a country with a view to development and the capacity of governments, and I would say all institutions, to plan, formulate, and program policies and fulfill their functions. So it is up to all institutions, especially public institutions, to tackle the issue of governance. There are 8 main characteristics of good governance: rule of law, transparency, responsibility, orientation by consensus, equality, inclusivity, effectiveness, efficiency, and accountability. As regards the judiciary branch, many of these issues are being tackled, they're being addressed for a long time, and many others are still not widely fulfilled. The 2030 agenda, they strengthen a holistic vision on sustainable development, and they have certain targets that are extremely important. Poverty, fighting poverty, hunger, health, education, gender equality, universal distribution of drinking water and sanitation, clean energy, work and labor and economic growth, industry and innovation, fighting inequality, sustainable cities, consumption and production, climate, life in water, life on land, and one that is entirely related to the institutions of the justice system, which are peace, justice, and strengthening of institutions, especially institutions that build the democratic order. The 2030 agenda is a process of construction that resulted from collective work that didn't begin yesterday. It's been going on for some time and had the participation of several sectors and organizations of civil society. The aim of sustainable development resulted from a range of meetings that I will not go over each one of them. You're all familiar with them, and resulted in the current agenda, which the judiciary has pledged to. The judiciary branch, especially the Supreme Court, and in particular the National Justice Council, there's a portal which contains several of the objectives of the agenda. Councilor Maria Teresa is here. Council member Maria Teresa will explain with more details and knowledge than me. But I would to just provide this overview on the work of the CNJ, the National Justice Council. So the 2030 agenda is the UN Human Rights Agenda. It was approved in 2018 and adopted by 193 countries, including Brazil, which incorporated the 8 Millennium Development Goals, both in the 2015 agenda and in the 2030 agenda. And one should add that the Brazilian judiciary branch is pioneer in the democratic world in terms of the institutionalization of the 2030 agenda, and has indexed in its database with 80 million cases each one of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It's important to provide this context so that afterwards we can discuss the possibilities, difficulties, and weaknesses. So the national target number 9 of the judiciary is precisely to integrate the 2030 agenda, which contains peaceful solutions. This has already been discussed yesterday and today. These are judicial solutions and extrajudicial solutions that are planned and preventive for judicialized disputes. The CNJ acts through several commissions, and there is a commission which is precisely designated to conduct the discussion regarding the 2030 agenda, with its main representative here, Dr. Maria Teresa, who will talk about this permanent commission for monitoring the SDGs and the 2030 agenda. Among the attributions of this commission, there is the proposal of studies and proposing judiciary policies, representing the CNJ, coordinating the laboratory. This is just a brief overview. When I was invited to speak, I thought I would make a more detailed presentation, but with Dr. Maria Teresa will address all these aspects, I am sure. The 2030 agenda in the judiciary contains the following issues, each one of them very relevant, and they all address topics that were addressed in the previous panel. So rights of children and adolescents, child and youth courts, fiscal execution and public registrars, international law, statistical reports, collective actions and environmental law, right to social assistance, right to health, right to work, internal management, penal law, military penal law, and criminal procedural law, penal execution, electoral law. And so it is a very extensive agenda and quite diversified. There are certain initiatives that have already been taken, and they deserve to be highlighted. So I selected the fact that the CNJ in 2015 reserved 20% of the positions in public examinations for civil servants for Black judges and candidates. And so this is very significant after hearing the previous speaker on structural racism and exclusion of a group that is so relevant, the group of Black population more sensitive to violence, exclusion, and all types of discrimination. On the other hand, the labor judges since 2004 have been fighting all forms of discrimination in labor relations, supporting public policies to include discriminated workers in the world of labor. Now, the governance practices, in fact, are very important and essential, especially when we know that we are aware of the scarcity of resources that need to be optimized. I refer both to human resources and material resources. So governance practices are very positive and capable of bringing about positive results. So the idea of how to improve management in face of scarce resources. CNJ signed with the UN in 2019 a pact with the aim of identifying, disseminating, and sharing good practices aimed at reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. CNJ, it relies on certain resources that are privileged. First, I'd like to highlight the importance of CNJ in justice in numbers. Now, comparing internationally, I'd say that the Brazilian judiciary branch is the only judiciary that relies on a publication that has been published annually for several years on all its bodies and members. We have data on the judiciary branch which are being improved along time, and data that allows making diagnoses and precise diagnoses based on which we can think of solutions.
They are actually based on scientific grounds, on data banks of data collected in courts. And on the other hand, several successful practices have been included that favor the dissemination of such practices in several courts. The results are when these diagnoses or assessments are elaborated, we have an improvement in delivery of jurisdictional services, an increased satisfaction index by users, and we favor positively the image of the judiciary branch. This is a trend. This is not the portrait of today. We know that the number of cases solved is still very low. This is a major flaw. We also have an abusive use of the judiciary that has not been able to tackle this situation. And the Association of Judges in Brazil has published on the access to justice have been undermined. It is not the access of the population as a whole, but the active parts, the authors and the defendants refer to a very small number of actors. And this is the core of my presentation. We have several incentives and thousands of challenges ahead of us. And we do need to know that we need to know this reality in order to face such challenges. Democracy, and Professor Oscar showed us several aspects of this situation and how we're going through a stress. Democracy has a quality as regards systems that are not democratic, either totalitarian or authoritarian, which is malleability. Being able to adapt, to adjust to new challenges, and bringing the participation of a larger number of sectors to face these challenges. We know that our 88 Constitution allowed broad access to the judiciary branch, especially to the Federal Supreme Court, which somehow creates a situation in which judicialization is high. And the way we deal with it has not yet been tackled in such a way in which, on the one hand, provided for a faster, swifter delivery of justice and to several sectors of society. And on the other hand, we also have measures that are bold and transforming, such as public hearings, the amicus curiae initiative, the idea that the judiciary should be open to the participation of society as a whole. And I believe that this event is an example, an extraordinary example of this type of opening. There are, however, a long way to go, such as the corporate bias. How it means a problem to be tackled not only by the judiciary, but by society as a whole, for us to have the conception of a rule of law. On the other hand, a culture that has not yet allowed for conciliation and mediation practices to be more used, not only by the judiciary, but by the other institutions that are part of the justice system, such as the defender's office, the prosecution service, law in general. Our culture does not admit in it integrally the benefits of solutions that are more consensual and more shared. And we also have another issue that needs to be taken into account. And it is within good governance, which is the rendering of accounts, transparency, the idea that we need to open more and more to society. These are all topics we need to discuss. And I also would like to mention data. If on the legal side we have several issues that places us in a highlight in the democratic world, we have a constitution that is democratic, we have several pieces of legislation of great quality. On the other hand, we need to face a reality that is a reality of exclusion and inequality. And we heard Gabriel this morning talking to us about situations that are faced in the everyday lives of the Black population, showing the idea of legality, rights, equality, and isonomy has its other side, its reverse in actual reality within society. And these are some data to illustrate this issue of inequality and how much the law is not yet what we observe in society, in concrete data. Just to give us an idea, Brazil is holds the 9th worst position within 189 countries as regards inequality. That is, we are hugely unequal. It is frightening, and it makes us see that the equality that we see in law is just rhetorical. On further detail, the 1% share of those richest concentrates 23% of the income, well beyond the world average, which is 12%. Half of the population receives 90% of the income, and the other half, only the remainder 10%. And this information by the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, the FGV, we showing that poverty increased 33% between 2014 and 17. These are scientific data elaborated by the FGV, the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, and they are based on reality. This same publication shows that between 2015 and 18, the loss of income on average was 3.44%, stronger amongst youth and those with less years of schooling. And those between 15 and 19 years of age lost as much as 20% of their income. Here we can see the amount of people under the extreme poverty line, i.e., with household income per capita lower than $1.90 per day. So there has been a loss both in absolute numbers of people and also percentages, showing data from the year 2012 to 2018. In addition to this inequality that is unacceptable, these millions of people living in extreme poverty, they live without treated sewage. And 35 million people do not have drinking water or potable water. And here we're talking about public policies. Not only the executive and the legislative are involved, but also the judiciary are involved in these policies. Well, the emergency benefit because of the pandemics revealed 46 million Brazilians invisible to the eyes of the government. They do not have even civil registration. If we think about sustainable development, this issue needs to be a priority. It cannot be abandoned. We cannot talk about equality when we have a situation such as this one. That was revealed, but it was known. But now it is more explicit and visible.
Another data, Gabriel gifted us or enlightened us regarding structural racism. Here I'd like to show another side of exclusion, which is related to the participation of women. As you can see, and this is data from UNDP, in 2020, women in Brazil, their share of their participation is much lower than in other countries of Latin America. I won't go over each one of them. You can see here the table. If we contrast Mexico and Bolivia, well, look at Brazil's position here in this ranking. Another issue related to women. Since 2014, and we are in 2020 now, no woman has been appointed to the higher courts in Brazil. This is relative because we recently had a woman who's been appointed to the higher court of labor. In the last decade, women have been occupying less than 15 or 14% of positions in STF and in these courts. And so we still face a situation of inequality and exclusion that needs to be tackled so that we can live in a more democratic country and more Republican country. Thank you very much. Congratulations, Professor Sadecki, for the excellent presentation, which shows very clearly a very delicate situation that the judicial system in Brazil and Brazilian society in general faces in terms of inequality and difficulty in implementing the 17 SDGs, and the strategic role of the judiciary and higher bodies in the implementation. Because in Brazil, specifically, there's a strong role played by the judiciary and the Supreme Federal Court, so that events such as this one and the possibility of interlocution with experts on the level of Professor Sadek and others allows us to think about the need to take these SDGs seriously, because the context of the situation of inequality in Brazil is very sensitive, which is also related to conflicts. In Justice in Numbers 2020, the number of conciliations in Brazil was 12.5%, and this level is unaltered since 2015, in spite of the expansion of the structure, showing very clearly that even the use of mediation of conflicts, it merits greater sophistication, and the CNJ has been heading innovation initiatives as regards implementation of technologies and online dispute resolution, which is related to the SDGs as well, and increased access. And I'd like to congratulate Professor Sadek, who unveils the complexity and the work that we will all need to do as professionals in our respective areas. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to our second speaker, Professor Daniel Michidiero, who is a dear friend, and I'd like to give the floor directly to him for his presentation. Thank you, Professor Gierli. Very pleased to be here to join you. You are a dear friend and long-standing friend. We've had many discussions about processes and the path of civil society in our country. Professor Sadek, it's a joy to share this panel with you. I paid a lot of attention to your presentation, and I hope we can in some way dialogue or discuss change of the profile of civil society and Supreme Courts in Brazil, so that we can tackle these challenges that you pointed out. And by saying this, I'd also like to greet Council Member Maria Teresa Gomes, who is leading several important changes in our law and also in the way we are thinking of civil society and the 2030 agenda. I'd like to also greet Justice Luiz Fux, President of the Supreme Court. And so there is effective mobilization around the debates that we need to promote in order to implement the good administration of justice, which entails redesigning of civil society and especially the Supreme Courts or higher courts. So my work has been greatly facilitated by the previous speaker. My main aim is to discuss what is necessary, what needs to be done for the Supreme Court and the TST and the STF. So what needs to be done for these courts to be able to play their role of unity of law, legal security, freedom for all, with a minimum of resources, of time resources and human resources involved in this operation. In the 2030 agenda, there are certain targets that have been translated by the CNJ for civil society in particular. One of them is a target that I'd like to draw your attention to, Target 7, which involves prioritizing the judging of cases involving repeat players and repetitive processes or cases. Naturally, this target 7 involves a great dose of promotion of efficiency and a state of affairs linked to good practices, good governance of Brazilian civil society. However, I'd like to propose a complementary approach to the approach focused on the idea of solution of repeated cases based on mechanisms proposed in a more sensitive and visible way by the 2015 So since we began to awaken more deeply to the institutional design of civil society in Brazil, I'd like to draw your attention very briefly to the fact that we experience from the end of the 18th century to the beginning of the 21st century, we've experienced deep and sensitive transformation in the way we produce law and the unity of law. And this sensitive transformation in the way we promote law and the unity of law, this has an impact, a decisive impact on the role of Supreme Courts. So a challenge that Professor Sadecki brought to us, this is exactly what I wanted to submit to our discussion here. The Supreme Court has been conducting this discussion. It's almost an image of the Supreme Federal Court on the couch, on a psychologist's couch, becoming aware of its own institutional role and reacting or responding to the need to change the way in which it exercises its role and the way it sees the efficacy of its own decisions. Obviously, I don't have time here to analyze the 18th century, the 21st century, but the central point is that 20 years ago, maybe less, if we were in a bank queue, we don't have so many queues today, but because people have access to internet banking, so there are less bank queues. But if we were on a bank queue and asked anybody randomly the name of one Supreme Federal Court justice, nobody would be able to answer, because the Supreme Federal Court was completely unknown. And today, I am sure that if we speak to anybody at all, anybody on the street, at the ice cream parlor or whatever, and ask, have you heard of Justice X, Justice Y? I am sure that people will know. And this is the result. This results from a very important fact, that we have become aware that law and rules in general are not the object of interpretation. They are the result of interpretation. And if rules are the result of interpretation, the reconstruction of the meaning of the text written by the legislator in the framework of a doctrine, it is easy to see that the way Supreme Courts were designed at the end of the 18th century, based on the French and the Portuguese Supreme Courts, and which influenced the Brazilian Supreme Court, all this starts with the lack of understanding of the current reality. Because if we look at the institutional design of these courts, we will realize that people used to think of these courts as a court of control and jurisprudence or case law, whose effects were to produce jurisprudence uniformity. So a court of control, or the vertex courts, the Supreme Court and the STJ, this court supposedly is aimed at correcting mistakes of ordinary courts in the interpretation of cases. And so each one should have their day, each one would have their day in the Supreme Court, because after all, the last response would only be given when each of the litigants access the court. Now, from a sociological point of view, this brings a huge problem, because not everybody could actually reach this vertex and they would get any answer or get any answer. But from a normative point of view, this caused an explosion of the vertex courts, because if each case needs to be re-examined reactively for the court to exercise control, this means that a court such as the Supreme Court with 11 justices and the STJ with 33 justices cannot respond to all the states and the federal district. That's math, simple math. You don't need to resort to more legal arguments than that. So we used to imagine that this design would be appropriate for a way of understanding law that imagined that the norm was written in the text and that the text contained the only possible meaning and response. And so the court needed to act on each case reactively, looking at the past in order to correct the past. And what it produced was merely a declaration of the sense or the meaning that was enshrined in the norm. And so the problem is that the key assumption of this function and these effects was eroded along the 20th century and reached the 21st century completely exhausted. Now, the assumption, I'm going to, well, I wrote a book on Supreme Courts in 2013, and so the assumption underlying this reasoning is that judges
simply declared pre-existing norms, and the judge in Bouche de la Loi, in Montesquieu, also present in England, both in France and in England. Blackstone said that judges were the oracles of the law. Since the beginning of the 20th century, we realized that the language is wrong, it is porous, and texts show more than one meaning, and those who deal with law, lawyers, judges, magistrates, justices, have a first core task to give meaning to texts, describing meaning to texts, obviously within a frame that is rational. But interpreting law implies deciding on the meaning of law. If this is true, it seems that we need to turn the page and realize that a good justice system is not necessarily a system that makes all people have one day at the Supreme Court. A good justice system is not one that makes, depending on the Supreme Court, the actual materialization of the principles of security, equality, and freedom. In fact, Supreme Courts should work based on a concrete case, given a guideline, and another word here, Professor Maria Teresa, where we coincide so a guideline based on a concrete case, looking at the future so that people can self-determine themselves, but without it being necessary for people to knock on the doors of courts every time a case is decided. If this is true, then we have here a transformation that is legitimate, that go through the control courts. They become interpretation courts that is giving meaning to law. If this is true, based on the case and under the limitations of the case, the actual case and democratically debated, then we end up consubstantiating a precedent that charged the meaning of law, bringing freedom as self-determination of people, and especially equality. Equality, those vis-a-vis the law. That is, Supreme Courts end up working in a prospective manner, looking at the future. And if this is true, there's no meaning in giving access to all. In fact, it is necessary to filter controversy, to admit ample debate of civil society using amicus curiae and public hearing, so that we have decisions and precedents discussed and weighed, but with the minimum use of human resources and time in the process. Therefore, in terms of sustainable development, this is something that we need to do. It is a step we need to take in Brazil, and this should be taken forward so that we can have at one time unity of law, lower cost, social cost, greater accountability, and trustworthiness, transparency, and responsiveness by justice. This is what I'd like to share with all of you. Thank you all very much. I also would like to congratulate Professor Daniel Mitidiero for an excellent presentation on a theme that is very dear to us, precedents and how to implement them within their theoretical assumptions. Very sophisticated presentation discussing a problem that Professor Sadek has also brought about, which is inequality, a very evident problem. So commenting on both presentations, we shall not lose sight of the filtering of sensitivity or of accessibility, I beg your pardon, to higher courts, that it is not filtered only to those who have privileged access to higher courts. And we have research by Professor Susana Costa at the University of São Paulo showing that empirically higher courts tend to create precedent, especially by the large authors, in detriment of occasional ones and eventual ones. This needs to be tackled because we clearly want precedents to be implemented, yes, but in order for us to achieve the SDGs, we need high or large and small authors or involved need to be involved in the creation of precedents that may involve democratic processes and that enforce the law in such way. Thank you very much. And now, without further ado, I'd give the floor to Councillor Maria Teresa Willy Gomes, who will also address this issue. And Professor Sadek has already mentioned to us and asked about the paths of the judiciary in order to achieve the SDGs as much as possible. You have the floor. Dr. Gierli, I'd like to greet you and all participants. And a dear salute to Maria Teresa Sadek, Dr. Daniel, also for their excellent presentations. I will try to be as objective as possible. And I would like to thank you very much and thank Justice Fux very much for the invitation, and Judge Pedro Felipe, who is also working on the 2030 agenda in the Supreme Court. I'd like to focus more on the 2030 agenda and the judiciary branch. So I will talk about the historical time and how the 2030 agenda was institutionalized by the CNJ. And secondly, I will speak about the initiation of the Justice Fux as our president, and then I will talk about the implementation now, including the 2030 agenda in the Supreme Federal Court. This webinar addresses governance and democracy. In this perspective, we have the focus of governance and the 2030 agenda, and I'd like to talk about the platform of the 2030 agenda in our Supreme Court, an innovative platform that will help facilitate all those judged in the Brazilian Supreme Court, and it's sharing with other Supreme Courts around the world. So we need to feel and look at the data regarding the judiciary branch in an innovative manner, externally to the power, with indicators that are common, adopted by hundreds of countries, and adopted by the United Nations. So we need to look at the targets and topics that are subject to judicialization. Who are the rights holders and where things are happening inside the judiciary branch? This is the innovation brought about by the 2030 agenda, and it is revealing gradually the main human rights violations, the obstacles, challenges in order for us to achieve sustainable development. Integrating the 2030 agenda to the judiciary and looking at this integration in 3 levels through the actions, activities, both and mid activities and partnerships in the judiciary allows this innovative and challenging look. So to talk about the platform of the 2030 agenda in the judiciary, I will talk about the moment when this agenda became institutional in the judiciary in Brazil in the year of 2018. I'd like to highlight that as a counselor, I am in my second office, and first of all, I worked with Justice Carmen Lúcia, with Justice Toffoli, and also Justice Fux.
I had the privilege of verifying that gradually the agenda has been institutionalized and strengthened. The theme of the 2030 agenda, it started in 1945 with the Declaration of Human Rights, bringing together all countries and nations around common goals of peace and nonviolence and human rights. In the year 2000, the leaders of countries and nations understood that it would be necessary to establish targets and indicators, measurable targets and indicators. And I think this is a very positive point of the agenda, to work with targets and planning and efficiency and accountability and being accountable for what is being done, showing what is being done. So from this perspective and the academic perspective, my doctorate thesis in sociology at the time, as part of the prosecutor's office, was on how to plan the actions of the prosecutor's office regarding the 8 millennium goals which preceded the 2030 agenda, the MDGs. And so the big challenge was in the data of the judiciary. As Professor Sadeghi said, the judiciary has a database of over 80 million cases, data judi, concentrated in the CNJ, receiving information from all courts. And the challenge is to understand these data. Not only understand the data from a quantitative point of view, how many cases, who are the people involved, the amount of the causes, and so on. And so this is being done brilliantly by CNJ, specifically the DPJ. But our challenge is a different understanding, an understanding of what the goals are and the targets and indicators that the 193 countries need to reach by 2030, and the ones that Brazil needs to reach by 2030. And based on this initial understanding, then we can institute an innovative methodology for analyzing the database with the 80 million cases and ask ourselves, of the targets that Brazil proposes to fulfill, what are the actions that are judicialized? Regarding poverty reduction, for instance, there is a specific target for poverty reduction by 2030. So what actions do we have, or cases do we have involving sanitation systems in municipalities that don't have basic sanitation, for instance? And so there is a preceding question: what municipalities don't have basic sanitation? And out of these, how many actions have been proposed? And so this is not just analyzing the judiciary data. It's a study of the targets and indicators that the agenda intends to reach. And based on that, or within that framework, you see what human rights are being violated and what are the obstacles to sustainable development that are reaching the judiciary. So this is the history then, from 2018 to 2020, it's a very recent history, and Professor Sadek has already made an introduction. And so recent history of institutionalization, she is reading a text, I'm sorry. So the first normative act of CNJ on the SDGs expressly, Resolution 255, a resolution edited at the time of the presidency of Carmen Lucia on gender equality and strengthening of the participation of women in the judiciary through positions of leadership and participation as speakers and lecturers. So this happened at the end of the management of Minister of Justice Carmen, in one of the last plenary sessions that she chaired. And so we received this request from the magistry associations. And so this was approved unanimously by the plenary. At the beginning of Justice Toffoli's management and his commitment with human rights, we had Administrative Order 123 of 2018, creating the Interinstitutional Committee on the 2030 Agenda with internal and external players. And so the purpose of this committee was to analyze which targets and indicators of the 2030 Agenda, how these targets and indicators are related to the targets of the Brazilian judiciary. Following that, in 2019, a permanent committee on 2030 Agenda was created, was approved unanimously. 3 committees were created, among which the Agenda Committee, which is currently made up of 3 council members under my responsibility, the chair of this commission, and also the councilors Henrique Áviles and Flávia Pessoa. And so 2 Ibero-American meetings were held, and some results very quickly. First, concern with reliable and current data. More than 90 courts in Brazil are organized through a system of management of unified procedural tables, one of the main bases for the Justiça em Números. When we see there are 20 branches of law and over 2,000 topics for each one of these branches. And so this is where we worked with microdata. So we analyzed one by one each of the topics, over the 3,000 topics, to see what SDG they were connected to, such as health or labor or the criminal part, SDG 16 or SDG 15, forests and environmental crimes. And so I am deeply thankful to the team for all the work they did. And so we did this indexing one by one. We sent forward this to the DPJ and they approved. And in the last Justiça em Números, we have the adoption of this indexing. And so over 80 million cases that are in the CNJ base were actually indexed to the SDGs. And this is an innovative methodology, and it's the first time that we see the court organizing itself in relation to the SDGs. And so as a result of all this, we can clearly see which SDGs are being more demanded and which human rights are being violated and what data we don't have in the judiciary and that the agenda wants to see. For instance, we need to give visibility to the victims through information on the victims, on income, ethnicity, migratory status, geographic location, race, etc. And the same for sustainable development, especially as regards environmental issues, which leads us to verify that there's judicialization or significant judicialization regarding SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and effective institutions, as well as 8, which is labor, 17 on fiscal execution, 1 on poverty, 3 on health. So we can see an excess of judicialization, how to prevent the problem from happening, and even scarcity of judicialization, relevant topics that should be in the judiciary and are not. Regarding the end activity, Resolution 325 was instituted the national strategy of the judiciary for the period of 2020-2026, including especially the 2030 agenda. Regarding extrajudicial actions, also there's been an incentive for all ombudsman's offices and also extrajudiciary registrars to implement the 2030 agenda. And so the big challenge, and Sadeki mentioned something really important, is that there is a very important contribution from public hearings and non-government organizations and teaching institutions. And so we have here a very important role, which is for Target 9. Target 9 is the national target approved by the courts for integration of the 2030 agenda. It's the first qualitative target of the courts. It's the first movement. It's an endogenous movement coming from the judiciary, from the courts, to identify the court. The court chooses one of the 17 SDGs and decides to work with, say, 5 or 17 or whatever. And so it verifies what are the most judicialized topics according to the structure with the over 300 topics. And so of these 3 most judicialized topics, the court will present or formulate an action plan.
Well, there are 7 columns in a spreadsheet. What, where, when, how much. So we meet every fortnight with all courts to listen to them and how we can support in order to make this replicable. We realize that regarding Target 9, there's a major concern, but especially labor on SDG 8, SDG 17, several courts, and 5 against violence against women and gender, and others related to poverty and health. How to take this dialogue further in addition to courts, because innovation here is based on the initiative of persons, of people who are part of institutions. So in addition to our fortnight meetings with courts, we also have fortnight meetings with external guests and other agents, and also through the laboratory for SDGs created using the experience of several courts. We have contact with people and we have a problem. We identify a problem regarding a certain SDG and they dedicate to solving that problem. So we address very complex issues that have repercussions in several areas, such as the social, economic, and environmental. We talk about indigenous issues, legal Amazon, the accident at Brumadinho, and etc. They are being addressed by counselors, CNMP, and CNJ, and the DBU and AGU and the CNJ. We are following the 2030 agenda. In the judiciary, we are building indicators specific to the judiciary branch. We're working with micro data with a very high level of disaggregation. And we also verify things. There's no point reaching only where we are in terms of disaggregation. We need to disaggregate further There's no point saying medication. We need to know which medication. There's no point talking about environmental crime. We want to know where are the arsons taking place, or where are the fires, I beg your pardon, taking place. Municipalities, the concentration of problems by neighborhood, where, for example, labor accidents are taking place. So we work with micro data, macro data, and metadata. And we analyze the concentration of these problems. Well, regarding challenges, I believe that the presidency of Justice Fux is very innovative regarding this agenda. He made it very clear when he took his presidency that the 2030 agenda is part of his main guidelines of management. He has already innovated, creating the Observatory of Human Rights with the participation of civil society. He is now going to create the Environmental Observatory. We have the resolution number 333, which is the core of the judiciary branch. In the same way, courts publish data on the transparency portal. Courts will also post, with the support of CNJ, an item named statistics of the end activity, showing how judicialization occurs and how it is addressed to the SDGs. This is being done by 2 different commissions with the support of the Special Secretariat for Projects, coordinated today by Judge Marcos Lirio, with an excellent work. The other resolution that is recent is the policy for governance of public procurement in terms of hiring of personnel. It was built along a whole year, and it has the whole framework of the middle activities regarding sustainability in public hiring. And now we're talking about the platform of 2030 in the Brazilian Supreme Court. So this movement that started in the CNJ and reaches the Supreme Court through Justice Fux, it's very, it is amazing. We have 193 countries participating in this agenda, and Brazil is the first one to be concerned or to actually take further this platform. So we are studying ways of how to replicate that research methodology of the CNJ, but based on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the only court that does not adopt the tables that other courts adopt. The idea is, first, what are the targets and indicators of 2030 agenda? What are the keywords? How can UN agencies identify these keywords based on what we have identified there? Based on that, we are going to see if we can find these keywords. We are going to do this through machine learning, and based on the classification of distribution, how we can improve this distribution, create a new taxonomy that allows automatic indexation to SDGs. And looking at the future, we imagine we're going to have a new taxonomy that allows for indexation of cases in the Supreme Court to SDGs through this work that has already been done. That is human intelligence guiding artificial intelligence, and they go hand in hand. So far, we have done the identification of the words per idea, per SDG, the concepts, the study of the TPU of the Supreme Court to index to SDGs, creation of new standards of taxonomy index to the agenda, and also a new criterion, I beg your pardon, not only the object of the causes, but the subject. Who are the subjects that are having their human rights violated? I heard excellent mentionings here today. Incarcerated population, racial issues, gender issues. There are several stakeholders and subjects, so this is our focus. Also the legislative indexation and this is the major challenge, the disaggregation of this data, of this micro data, to reach municipalities and neighborhoods, regions. This is the main challenge. Our challenge is not specifically to look at Brazil vis-a-vis other countries, but we want to get to the municipality level. Regarding future, for the internalization of the Supreme, the new cases will go past, will be read automatically. We're going to read decisions, taxonomy by SDG, classification of subjects and objects indexed to SDGs, limitations of main decisions in other languages, and comparative studies. The platform will allow for an exchange of the new methodology in the way of systematization of decisions, so that councils and Supreme Courts in other countries can use this platform and exchange data in the platform and verify how countries in general are working regarding global current topics. People affected by pandemics, emergency benefits with over 200,000 cases, or lawsuits, migration, and so many others related to human rights.
So what the judiciary can produce for society. So this generates internal reflection by the members of the judiciary and its staff, and external reflection from those who look at the judiciary with this other perspective. So if Brazil has targets to be fulfilled, what are the judicialized actions? What are the violations of human rights, and where should we prioritize? And so fostering of interinstitutional dialogue and new solutions, including the digital platform for the 2030 agenda. So innovation and through the CNJ and the Supreme Court is a legacy that can be shared with the judiciary of other countries, more than organizing data and classifying them and seeing what human rights are being violated and how to provide a quick response and solution with the use of existing technologies, among which the online dispute resolution and other alternatives for conflict resolution, and leaving the more complex issues to the judiciary. So human intelligence and artificial intelligence in favor of promotion of human rights. And so this is the perspective of the innovation brought by Minister Fux in this webinar, the reflection that the 2030 agenda indexed to the cases that are today being addressed by the judiciary can be a new way of looking at law and what rights are being violated, and a new way of choosing the priority agenda. So congratulations, Justice Fux, for choosing the platform of the 2030 platform as one of the instruments that in the management of this court. Thank you. Congratulations, Council Member Maria Teresa Gomes, for the excellent presentation, showing the clear challenges that the Brazilian judiciary has been facing. And I'd like to point out three aspects. The first regarding resolutions 331 of Data Jude regarding treatment of data, 333 on statistics, and also the importance of employing technology towards the implementation of human rights so that the SDGs can be implemented not only through increased productivity of the judiciary, but also qualitative improvement in the way the judiciary relates with society and the possibility of creating new ways of solving conflicts, such as online dispute resolution, which the judiciary is beginning to implement. There are several pilot projects within the CNJ for promoting this kind of implementation. And I'd also like to point out that Justice Fux has established one of the axes, which is precisely digital justice and the possibility of 100% digital cases and processes, proceedings, and other technologies that. So I would like to thank Justice Fux for the invitation and congratulate him on the initiative and the way he's been conducting the Supreme Federal Court in his management. Also, I'd like to greet Judge Pedro Filipe dos Santos, Professor Alexandre Freire, who also played an important role in the Supreme Federal Court. And I'd like to offer to each of you a final minute for your final remarks. So first, Professor Sadek. I have learned a lot in this webinar yesterday and today, and I would like to congratulate Justice Fux for the initiative and say once again that this initiative is very likely to produce very important results. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sadek. I'll give the floor now to Daniel Mitidier. I have also learned a lot this morning. It's been a pleasure to hear you, Professor Maria Teresa and Professor Maria Teresa Sadek as well. And also I'd like to thank Justice Fux and Luis Pedro and Professor Lívia, our dear friend Alexandre Freire. The Supreme Court is to be congratulated as part of civil society and academia, as well as user of the Supreme Court as a lawyer. I'm very pleased to see the Supreme Court actually implementing all these innovations. Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Council Member Maria Teresa. Thank you very much for the opportunity and for your moderation of the panel. I'd like to greet my colleagues Maria Teresa Sadek and Daniel for their brilliant presentations. Since yesterday, I've learned a lot with this webinar. And I just want to say that the judiciary in Brazil has a mission, which means that it needs to come closer to society, to hear society. And the 2030 agenda has this perspective. What are the main targets and indicators that we need to reach by 2030 so that people can effectively have their rights secured? And if the violation of these rights reaches the judiciary, we need to read the judiciary data to know which are these cases, where are they, how to classify them according to a new innovative methodology that puts the humans at the center of all the work, because this is what moves us, what energizes us to work to secure human rights and human dignity. So congratulations, Justice Fux and all his team at the Supreme Court and the CNJ and this wonderful team that is organizing the webinar with academic participation, society participation. It's great to work together in the same direction with the same targets and goals and accountability, showing what we have and what we can do together. Thank you. Thank you. I'd also point out that we all who work in the legal system, we need to place human beings and citizens and fundamental rights at the center and make all efforts to reduce inequality in our country. And now we have Justice Fux at the presidency of the Supreme Court, beginning his office very clearly and showing what his priorities are, and with these timely proposals. One of them related to an area that I've been focusing on, which is precisely interaction with technology. And we are going to have a closing panel by Professor Richard Susskind. And here's his book, which is a reference here in Brazil already. So I'd like to greet Professor Susskind and give the floor back to the Master of Ceremonies. Thank you very much, Professor Dielli, for moderating this panel, as well as the speakers of the fourth panel. We will now hear the closing conference on the theme Supreme Court's Governance and New Technologies. And this webinar is being broadcast live by TV Justiça and also on 2 official channels of TV Justiça in Portuguese and the official channel of the Supreme Federal Court with the original audio in English. And we'd like to invite Professor Richard Susskind from the Oxford Internet Institute, technology advisor to the President of the High Court of Justice of England and Wales, doctor in law and computer science by the Oxford University. And the moderator is Professor Ronaldo Lemos from the University of the State of Rio de Janeiro, who has a doctorate in law by the University of São Paulo. Professor Ronaldo Lemos, thank you. You have the floor and the moderation of the closing conference. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to speak English to facilitate communication.
Pretty broad one. I think Brazil's judiciary is basically leading digital transformation in the government in Brazil, especially in regards to AI and transforming judicial processes into online processes. So my question for you is, do you think this is the future of courts? And basically, will the future of courts be an online future?
Thank you very much for that question. I envisage that we have to change conventional court systems. We have 3 major problems today. We have, of course, the COVID crisis. Many physical courts are closed, so we need to set up remote technology-based alternatives. Secondly, huge backlogs are building up, and you in Brazil already have very large backlogs in your court system. And thirdly, we have the traditional access to justice problem that, say, in civil law, civil disputes, most court systems are too complex, they're too costly, they take too long, and they don't really sit comfortably in a digital society. So the big question we need to ask, in my view, is this: is court a service or a place? Do we really need physically to come together in one room to resolve our legal differences? Or might there be very different ways of resolving legal disputes in the future? And we've seen during the COVID period already that there are some different ways where video hearings have been used much more successfully than most lawyers and judges would have anticipated. But I don't see this as the end point. I see this as the starting point, because I envisage a future for many disputes of what I call online courts. And I will give you an explanation of the two major components of online courts. And do stop me if I'm running on too long for each question.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, so I envisage two components to online courts. The first is what I call online judging. And that is when you have human judges deciding cases, but not in a physical courtroom. The evidence and the arguments are submitted to them in electronic form, and the judge responds in kind. It's almost like an exchange of emails. It doesn't work for all cases, but it works for many cases, particularly for low-value disputes in the civil area. And this is what is known as, and I'm sorry about this, an asynchronous process. Traditional court work is synchronous. That means that everyone has to be together at the same time to conduct the work of the court. Even in video, everyone has to be available at the same time. But with the asynchronous process, this is developed at the convenience of the court users, who can submit their argument and evidence at a time that suits them. As I say, it doesn't solve all disputes, but already early evidence from Canada, from Australia, from Singapore, from the United Kingdom suggests that many disputes and much of our backlog could be resolved in this way. But there's a second, more important component, and I call this the extended court. And this is more radical. This is the idea, in my view, in a modern court system, in a digital society, it's not enough that we only deliver the primary function of resolving disputes. I think we need to give much more help to our court users, because most court users in most countries can't afford lawyers. And so what we should have online, and here we have a first generation AI, it's like expert systems. I wrote my PhD on this subject in Oxford in the 1980s, how we could use systems to help guide people through complex areas of law. So we need online help to help people understand their rights and duties, to help them understand the legal options available to them, to help them organize their evidence, to help them formulate their arguments. We need that kind of help online if we are to make our court systems genuinely accessible. It should be a worldwide aim that we help people understand and enforce their entitlements in our court system. So that's one way of extending courts. Also, I believe within the court system, there should be opportunities before cases come before judges for parties to negotiate, for parties to be mediated, for there to be early neutral evaluation, basically alternative dispute resolution, not as a private sector alternative to courts, but baked in, built into the conventional court system. So in summary, during COVID, we have seen a move towards essentially video hearings. But what we've done is we've dropped our existing system into video. The same rules, the same people, the same problems, the same complexities, the same delays, and in many ways, the same costs too. If we are to go beyond this, We have to stop thinking about automation, stop thinking about how we computerize our existing ways of working. We've done that for 60 years. We have to think of transformation, using technology to allow us to deliver court services in quite different ways. And I say the way we do that is by the online courts that offer, firstly, online judging, and secondly, these extended court facilities.
Professor Susskind, this is fascinating. And in your book, you basically talk about a lot of case studies that go from China to the UK regarding use of technology in courts. In Brazil, conciliation rates are 9% of all cases. It's part of the judicial process here, but it's been 9% for several years. It hasn't gone up at all. Do you think that technology can help these conciliation rates to basically increase?
We don't have the data yet, but here's my instinct, that alternative dispute resolution around the world, whether it be conciliation or mediation, or the many other techniques, has still involved the gathering together of human beings in a physical space. It's still involved the participation of a person who is in some sense in a power position, the person who's undertaking the conciliation. And it seems to me that what we can envisage, and I suspect it'll be easier, more accessible, and better for participants, is the transfer of that work into an online environment. So alternative dispute resolution becomes ODR, online dispute resolution, electronically enabled ADR. And my feeling is that we haven't made the alternatives yet sufficiently affordable, sufficiently convenient, sufficiently intelligible. It still involves experts. It still involves conciliation specialists. Somehow, I believe we need to make our justice system and our alternatives more accessible. And what can be more accessible than having it easily available online to many people who every day are using technology to buy goods, to watch entertainment, to interact with one another. My hope and feeling is that if we make our ADR available online, people will have greater confidence, people will be more comfortable, and therefore the success rate is likely to be higher. But that's a hypothesis that needs tested by experiment. We should be in no mistake, though, that ADR, alternative dispute resolution, has not fulfilled its early promise. And I think it's because it's too similar to the traditional court process.
I like very much when you say that there is no statistics or numbers about the future. So a lot of these changes here, I think it's not evidence-based, but it's something that we should look forward to. So 2 questions. Brazil has 80 million lawsuits. This is data from 2017. I don't think it's gotten any better since then. And on top of that, judicial systems are mostly designed for lawyers and for judges. How do you make sure that we design judicial systems for the user, for the citizen that needs basically to access that service?
Let me first of all deal with your evidence point, because it's an important one. And I want every policymaker and every judge to listen to this. Deciding to do nothing is a policy choice. We do not have the evidence for the status quo. We don't have the evidence for today's system. And I find it difficult when people say to me, there isn't evidence from the future when we don't have evidence of the current system. But staying as we are is a policy-based choice that's not based on evidence. It's because we don't generally around the world have, for example, useful data about the level of satisfaction from most court users. We don't have large bodies of accessible, digestible, analyzable data about our court systems. So I don't think moving on a well-intentioned instinct to a different way of life is the leap that most people suggest. Because today we are not, our current policy making is not based on sound evidence. It's not based on sound data. It's what we have. That's point one. Yeah, I've heard also the 80 million statistic. In my book, I say 100 million. I was corrected, but my understanding was, and this may be wrong, it was 80 million backlog and 20 million current cases within the system. In any event, folks, it's a large amount of cases that need to be handled. But you're absolutely right that what we have today in most jurisdictions, in all jurisdictions, is a court system designed by lawyers for lawyers, designed by judges for judges. And what we need to do now is take a fundamentally different approach. It needs to be user-centric. We used to use new techniques called design thinking techniques, the whole purpose of which is to put the users, the clients, the customers at the heart of the process. And so if one thinks of the rules of procedure, in England, one of our senior judges once said, any system that's got a 2,000-page user manual has a problem. And that's the civil justice system of England and Wales. We have thousands of pages of rules. There is no way that anyone designing a system with the non-lawyer in mind would think that acceptable. And so we need to start from the ground up. My first point is this, is that the challenge is not somehow to make more efficient our current system. It's to start from scratch. It's to start from the beginning, driven by the outcomes and the outputs that users need, not driven by the traditions of lawyers, not driven by the preferences of judges, but our court system is a public system, which, if to be genuinely accessible, has to be built around the needs of users. So the second point is when you use technology, and I've said this before, it's not about automating the old system. It's not about making the old system more efficient. It's about using technology to give rise to an entirely new system. And that's a huge challenge for many judges and lawyers, because the third point I want to make is you can't change the wheel in a moving car. We already have court systems that are up and running, delivering great services, but maybe not quick enough, maybe not affordable enough, but they're still operational. The answer is not to try and change that system. The answer, in my view, is to start a new vehicle, a new car, to set up something different that's user-oriented, using design thinking, a new form of court service. And my bet is, if we start at a modest level with fairly low value disputes and build from there, more and more work will come from the old system into the new system. The big mistake we're all making is trying to change the wheel on a moving car. We're trying to change the system as it runs. We need to set up a new car. And as I say again, and as it was in your question, this is not by lawyers for lawyers, it's by design thinking specialists with court users primarily in mind.
That's great to hear. The Brazilian judiciary is very prone to innovation. So as I mentioned in the beginning, Brazil does have some interesting building blocks. So our electronic procedural system, we call it PJE, it's pretty remarkable. And also the use of AI in the Brazilian judiciary system is progressing. There is even a report called Future of AI in the Brazilian Judicial System that I would love to share with you. But when we think about innovation, there's a lot of innovation happening outside the judiciary, the so-called legal tax, for instance. A lot of companies, startups doing very innovative things and basically benefiting users and lawyers. The only institution that does not use these innovations in Brazil is the judiciary themselves. So basically, users and lawyers are very much accustomed to use innovation outside of the judiciary, but not always these innovations got into the judiciary. How do you think should be the relationship of courts and legal innovation outside of courts?
Can I ask you a question, first of all, because you started by saying that judges were very supportive of innovation and change, and yet now you're saying that judges don't use the technology. Can you just explain that to me so I can give you the best answer?
Sure. The innovation that I mentioned is pretty much government-led innovation. So it's innovation that has been built by the judiciary itself. And that is pretty remarkable when you compare to other governmental branches. So for instance, the executive. I think the judiciary is taking the lead in terms of AI in Brazil. But it's not necessarily embracing all innovation that there can be and that are happening outside of the government system. So when we look outside of the government, there are amazing startups doing conciliation programs or even organizing judicial information better than the judiciary organizes itself, applying AI to basically analyze millions of cases to understand patterns for decisions. These have not trickled into the judiciary. So that's my question. It's good for inside innovation, but it's not good for embracing outside innovation. That's my point.
Okay. I know a fair amount of the Brazilian system. I have many friends and very many kind supporters in Brazil, but I can't claim to be a specialist. So forgive me if I don't get this exactly right. But from what I've seen, a lot of the innovation and change within the judicial system is automation rather than transformation. That's to say, it's improving electronic filing, it's improving case management, but it's perhaps not as transformative of the actual process of solving legal problems, of coming to legal decisions. And so it's not a criticism to say this, but I think there's far more automation within the government, within the public sector, than there is transformation. In the private sector, you're seeing far more emphasis on transformation. If we had been speaking 5 years ago, there were maybe 200 legal tech companies around the world. There are now about 5,000 or 6,000. I think there are more than 200 within Brazil, but each of them really is trying to do to a corner of law what Amazon did to book selling. And so to understand the private sector, it has to be seen as fundamentally disruptive. It's not supporting, enhancing, streamlining, improving the current system. It's challenging, displacing, disrupting the current system. And so how you can see, certainly within government, how there might be a resistance, because this is not an improvement of the past, this is a replacement of the past. And whether it be policymakers or judges, these tend to be very well-intentioned, but often quite conservative individuals. And so the kind of radical change that some people in the tech startup world want is not the kind of change that is wanted within the public sector. Now, this potentially presents a very significant challenge around the world for the public sector, because what you will see emerging is private sector alternatives to dispute resolution that are quicker, cheaper, easier to use, and for most purposes will settle people's legal disputes. They won't have the binding authority of the courts, but in a practical way, they'll help people move on with their lives and with their businesses. And the worry here for me is that if we don't, in the court system, in the public court system, provide a commercial, relevant, pragmatic service, if people prefer to use a private sector alternative, then this can actually dilute the impact of the rule of law. We need to have on a daily basis a functioning judicial system that is regarded as progressive, that's regarded as relevant, that's regarded as effective. And if the market takes court users elsewhere, then this is a failure of the state. And I underline the point again that unless the state is competing effectively with the market in dispute resolution, we run the risk of prejudicing people's respect for the law, for the bindingness of the law, for the authority of law.
That's great. Great to hear. And Professor Susskind, we are approaching the end of our very short time. I would like to ask you, what are the low-hanging fruits that a Supreme Court like the Brazilian one can basically seek to achieve? And basically, how do you build this path for this transformation within the judicial system that you're basically talking in your books and your studies?
I'm afraid I don't like the question, because low-hanging fruits are a distraction. What happens is, and governments around the world do this, they pick off the low-hanging fruit and it provides a temporary improvement. It relieves a pain temporarily, but it's not strategic. And we have to think beyond short-term gains to long-term sustainability. In fact, we need to think in 3 timeframes. We need to think, how do we get through the COVID crisis? How do we keep our court system functioning through this difficult time? That's the short term, hopefully. Then in the medium term, and this is maybe a little bit of an answer to your question, but I don't like low-hanging fruit, but we do need to think, how do we learn lessons from the COVID period? And how do we preserve and industrialize what has gone well during this period so that we can help address the growing backlog? But none of this is an alternative to the long-term thinking where we need to start from scratch. We need to be driven by users' needs, and we need to rethink the institutions, the people, the processes, the technologies that will greatly increase access to justice and in turn, as I stress, confirm and enhance people's confidence in the rule of law.
Thank you so very much. I think our time is over. I don't want to use it up anymore. And it's really a pleasure to have you with us. And thank you for being such a beacon in this debate of technology and the courts. Very good.
Thank you. The pleasure was mine. In fact, as I say, many friends in Brazil. I look forward to visiting again in person. And I hope your conference has been a massive success. Thank you.
Thank you.
We thank for the participation of our participant and our moderator. Please remember, on the event hot side, we have a tool that makes available and enables the citizen participation in the topics debated in this webinar. We would like to reiterate our thanks to the audience, to the participation of all who accompanied this webinar today. We wish you all an excellent afternoon. And with due authorization, we close this second and last day of the webinar, Supreme Court, Governance and Democracy. See you soon.